So I'm going to cover 6 topics rather briefly. I'm going to talk about economic growth, a little bit about really how recently that idea has become so important, particularly to government. Then I'm going to talk about what you might call spaceship Earth economics, finding a new perspective on economics. I couldn't resist saying something about COP26, so I will use that opportunity to make a particular point that I think wasn't given enough attention to at the meetings. Then I will talk about some of the simulation work I've done with my good friend and colleague in Britain, Tim Jackson, where we do simulations of alternative futures for Canada. And finally, I have a list of 12 things that need to change. So let me get started. I hope I don't go too fast. But there's quite a lot to cover in the short space of time. So let me say a few words about economic growth. There's a long history to the idea of economic growth. Of course, Adam Smith was very interested in studying it 200 years ago. But I think it's fair to say that what's happened in the last 50 years or so, maybe more than that, 70 years, I guess I'd have to say now, is how progress itself has come to be identified or almost defined by economic growth. One can almost date the formal time at which this happened. Here's a photograph from the founding meeting of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, to which all of the wealthy countries of the world belong. In the very first article,
Peter, I just wanted to jump in and note that we don't see your screen right now.
Oh dear, you should have told me that. We shouldn't have to tell me that.
No problem. I just realized it when you mentioned the photograph.
Right.
There we go. We've got it. Excellent.
Sorry about that. Well, I think you only missed one slide. Here's my slide showing how progress has come to be defined as economic growth. It's a nice little picture, not mine, but I like to show it. So here we have the first meeting of the OECD. So much has changed since then, particularly the makeup of the members. They're all men, all in dark suits, so that's not too relevant. What is most relevant here is what they set up the organization to do. The first aim of the OECD shall be to promote policies designed to achieve the highest sustainable economic growth and employment. So economic growth is front and center there and has remained that way ever since. Every year now, the OECD publishes this book, which they describe as an OECD flagship publication called Going for Growth, Shaping a Vibrant Recovery. Now, to be fair to the OECD, they have paid some attention in recent years to green growth, to different measures of growth, but there's still no doubt that the primary objective is to achieve economic growth measured by an increase in real gross domestic product year on year. So how have we been doing in the OECD? Well, there's OECD gross domestic product from 1970 to 2020, and it even shows the downturn due to COVID at the very end. And you can see also, maybe I can point to it here, the downturn that came about through the financial crisis. But the overall trend is pretty clearly one of continuous economic growth. What's not entirely apparent from that graph is that the rate of economic growth of the OECD countries has been in decline also since 1970. Now, of course, it's bounced around a lot, but you can see how this red trend line is heading down. And even if you take out these dips, the one from the recession and the one from COVID, the line is almost unchanged by that. It still shows a steep decline. So there's angst in the system that economic growth is in decline, and what are we going to do about that? That's not an angst that I particularly share, but it's part of the background to this presentation. One analysis of the situation that's very well worth consulting by Robert Gordon from the US, titled The Rise and Fall of American Growth, looks to the future based upon a very detailed account of the past and identifies 6 considerations, 6 factors, which he believes add up to a continual slowing of the rate of economic growth in the US, almost to zero by mid-century. And he's not the only reasonably mainstream economist who's saying that. So the times are changing, and there are really a couple of ways forward. One is to push back, to try to get the rate of economic growth up again by addressing some of those arrows that you see in that picture, by relaxing environmental standards so that more resources can be dug up. There are all sorts of things that are not particularly nice, in my view, which can be done to try to stimulate the rate of economic growth. The other way is to sort of get used to it, in fact, encourage it, and learn how to manage without growth. More on that later. One of the reasons why a growing number of observers are quite open to moving away from the pursuit of economic growth as a priority is the growing understanding and evidence that growth does not bring happiness. Here's data for the US. The red line shows per capita real income, how it grew, again, pretty steadily, 1945 to 2015. But the percentage of Americans who described themselves as very happy, well, it sort of went along with the increase in real income. They hadn't departed company at that point. But then look what happens to 2015. So there's a big decoupling of income growth and this measure of happiness. And there's lots more data to support this story, but I can only just give you the one slide for now. I like to put this forward in the following way. This is what the marketers would have us believe. This is what happens when you buy a bright new car and you get an open road and tremendous speed. But this is taken just a few kilometers from where I live in Toronto. And you can see what the reality for most drivers much of the time is when it comes to the automobile. So there's a disconnect in so many ways between growth, the pursuit of growth, the values that it encompasses, and what I think we now understand better adds to human and ecological well-being. Well, many people are calling not for an end of growth, but a different type of growth. And these are all designations that I've picked up from the literature: green growth, climate-friendly growth, inclusive growth, smart growth, clean growth, shared growth, pro-poor growth. When I look at these designations, what I see is, if you like, a list of things that growth isn't. It's not green, it's not climate-friendly, it's not inclusive, and so on. But you don't fix that problem by just addressing one aspect, as I guess is pretty obvious. Well, while all this has been happening, also since about the 1960s, when we began to see the first images from space, and we saw this is what the planet looks like from the moon. And I was a student in those days at this time, and it had it certainly had an impact on me, but on many others too, to say, well, how can you have an ever-growing economy on a planet which is clearly finite and only emits sunshine and emits waste heat? More on that later. Along comes Kenneth Boulding, who wrote a wonderful essay in 1966 called The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth. And I'll read this quote from him. He says, "The closed Earth of the future requires economic principles which are somewhat different from those of the open past. The closed economy of the future might be called the Spaceman Economy, in which the Earth has become a single spaceship without unlimited reservoirs for anything, either for extraction or for pollution, and in which, therefore, man, well, it's a bit dated in that respect, must find his place in a cyclical ecological system." This, if you like, was the founding principles of ecological economics, which is an aspect of economics, or a subdiscipline of economics, which is gaining all too slowly, but gaining in popularity. So let me just say a bit more about the worldview of ecological economics. If you've taken a first-year course in economics, you probably would have seen a diagram, something like this, to illustrate what an economy is, showing how firms supply goods and services to households. Households, being the ultimate owners of land, labor, and capital, make those available to firms, and you get this economic cycle. But if you want to use that framework for understanding how the economy, to use Boulding's view, is embedded in the planet, is just a subsystem of the planet, then there's lots that's missing. Well, in the center of this diagram, I didn't change that. There's the economic cycle. But what this shows is that for it to function, the economy has to extract resources. Here I'm showing an open pit mine and a forest, but of course there's more than that. This material is used, but it doesn't disappear. It ultimately finds its way back into the environment, into the atmosphere, into lakes, on land. And if it overstresses the capacity of the biosphere to accept these materials, that can disrupt these biophysical cycles, and you get a feedback here. So this is the worldview of ecological economics, and it really changes the way that we do economics. So to put some data to that graph, this graph shows, to that image rather, this graph shows from 1900 to 2015, the total materials extraction in billion tons a year for every year. So from 1900 to 1950, you see this steady increase. By the way, this is broken down into biomass, fossil fuels, ores and industrial minerals, and construction materials. It was, the annual use was growing up, or the annual extraction was growing at about 1.5% a year. Then from 1950 to 2000, the next 50 years, you can see the very rapid increase in materials being extracted from the planet to help to make it possible for the global economy to function. And then we come to the first part of the 20th century, where the rate of extraction has accelerated again. Now, as I say, all of this material either stays in the economy over a period, or it's ultimately thrown out as waste. Most materials don't stay in the economy forever, so there's a way of understanding the economy in terms of its throughput. The materials that are drawn in are used and then disposed of again. Now, when the volume is increasing like this, it's not surprising that we're hearing more and more about this idea of planetary boundaries. I'm hoping that you will have encountered this idea, but this is a diagram drawn by a number of scientists. The first version of it came out in 2009. What they tried to do was to identify for a number of very significant, globally significant environmental issues, what they call their safe space for humanity. And then they looked at the data for each of these and concluded that for some items like genetic diversity, disposal of nitrogen and phosphorus, we were already in the danger zone, far exceeding the safe space, and climate change is pushing outwards. So we have more materials being used, and we have more waste being disposed of, more land being converted. We've got some very big problems to tackle. One rather disheartening perspective on this is when you come and look at the Earth's land and mammals by weight. Here's humans. Each square represents 1 million tons of mammals. All of these other animals here, in a sense, owe their existence to humans. They're there to serve humans: cattle, pigs, goats, sheep, horses, and so on. What's missing from this are wild animals. And if you look at the amount that's missing, it's only this. It's about 4% now of all of the mammals that you see there, the humans and the ones that exist or are used by humans. Only about 4% of the mammals on Earth are wild, which is, I think, incredibly tragic. So now I want to turn a little bit to COP26. There's a whole lot that one can be said about that, but I want to use it to make a point which I think does not get adequate attention in discussions about climate change and what to do about it. And it starts from the observation that climate change is a stock problem, not a flow problem. It's not that. So here's an illustration. The stock of water in the bath depends upon the amount that flows in. But if you want to know whether you're going to have a good bath or not, you need to think about, well, what should the stock be? And then you control the flow to get there. Well, it's much the same with climate change. All of this attention given to net zero in a particular year is focusing on the flow and not on the stock. And as I'm going to show in a moment, there are many different paths to net zero. And they have very different implications for the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we have the idea of the global carbon budget, which in 2018 was defined in this way to give us a 66% chance of remaining below 1.5 degree average temperature rise. What could be the total cumulative emissions that we could still allow ourselves to do to stay within that limit? 2018, they estimated it to be, this is the IPCC, to be 420 gigatons of CO2. And in that year, we were putting out 42 gigatons of CO2, so that at the current rate, that carbon budget would be exhausted within a decade, starting in 2018. That's pretty grim news. So now let me explain some of my concern about focusing too much on net zero. I'm going to show you a graph like this, which shows GDP, emissions, target emissions, which I'm going to set, I think, at 90% reduction to be achieved by 2050, and a contribution of net emissions. So the net zero will be met in 2050. And then I'm going to show you a graph which shows the initial carbon budget. It's going to be set at 1,000. It'll be 10 times the current emissions, and it'll show the cumulative emissions as well. So this is what happens if you try to achieve net zero in 2050 by a linear reduction in emissions and a certain contribution up to 10% from net emissions of negative emissions rather, which is quite controversial, but I put something in for that. And here's how the economy is growing at 2% a year. So the economy is growing at 2% a year. Emissions are coming down linearly. And now let's see what that means for our carbon budget. Well, you see, here's the bad news. If we set the carbon budget at 10 times initial emissions, which is on the high side, I submit, the cumulative emissions from a linear approach to net zero exceeds the carbon budget in just 13 years. So what is the federal government suggesting is a good path down to net zero? Well, you can see how, if you saw the difference, the graph changes. You get a slightly steeper decline at the beginning. This would get us to a 40% reduction by 2030, and then net zero in 2028. These assumptions haven't changed. Let's see what happens to the budget. Well, it lasts longer, lasts over 15 years, but we still exceed it. So that's not going to be good enough to stay within 1.5, even as if we were starting from 2018, but we're 4 years beyond that. I expect the current carbon budget is probably being reduced. We'll know in April 22 what the new estimate is. Well, here's what some people hope for, which is, yes, we'll start reducing emissions, but along will come a new technology and we'll get a very sharp reduction in emissions. Economic growth is the same. The only thing that's changing is this path to net zero. Well, here we use the budget up in 10.5 years. So waiting for a technological breakthrough is a very, very bad strategy. There are ways to get to net zero and stay within the budget. One way is an exponential reduction in emissions. That means a certain percentage reduction each year in emissions per dollar of GDP. If we reduce emissions per dollar of GDP at 9.7% a year, we stay within the carbon budget. But we've never, ever done that in a single year. And to do it 28 years in a row is a huge, huge undertaking. Now, this is where economic growth can be seen not as the solution, but as the problem. If we don't have economic growth in that period, but we still have the exponential reduction in emissions, they still have to, that emissions per GDP dollar has to decline at a fast rate, but it's a lot slower than it was with economic growth, from 9.7 down to 7.9, and you'll see that we meet the budget. So my point here is simply to use COP26, a few comments on that, to remind everyone, if you need reminding, that it's not just the destination of net zero that matters, it's the path that we choose to get there. And I think that we need to do a much better job as a country and other levels of government as well on that matter. So I've done a lot of work trying to understand what the future options for Canada might be. And I like to do simulations to help me think about the issues, and I hope help others too. I'm going to just give you a quick overview of what we mean by ecological macroeconomics, because that's the term now being used to the kind of economics that I and others are doing. If you like, that's the standard view of macroeconomics. At least that's what it was for a lot of people before the financial crisis. A lot of macroeconomic models did not really include the financial system. Since then, Great progress has been made. Something called modern money theory had been around for a while, but it has lots of insights. And in the work that Tim Jackson and I do, we draw on modern money theory to characterize the financial sector in our models. Ecological economics was no better really than standard economics in its attention to the financial sector. We paid a lot of attention to this link between the natural systems, the natural world, and the real economy. Well, in ecological macroeconomics, we try to keep all three in play all the time. Now, I don't have time to tell you anything about the simulation model itself. I'm just going to give you some, I hope, interesting results. I'm going to show you a continuation of current trends and relationships. This work was done essentially 2017. So although I have since simulated the effect of COVID, I'm not going to go into that here. We'll just say the world's going to continue on, at least this is what a lot of people would like, as it was doing up to 2017, 2018. The second scenario is to introduce a significant price on carbon emissions, particularly from electricity generation, extensive carbon abatement in the non-electricity industry, and electrification of all road and rail transportation. And then sustainable prosperity, we add to that a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2040, a switch from investment, which is simply designed to expand the value of economic output, to green investment, which is designed to reduce impacts on the environment, increase transfer payments to reduce income inequality and reduce poverty, a lower rate of population growth, and reduced work hours. So let's see the results of these simulations. So what you're going to see in these graphs is a black line for the base case. That's if business as usual out to 2067. The carbon reduction scenario, where you pay a lot of attention to carbon, but let everything else go its own way. And then sustainable prosperity, which, as I just described, is a more comprehensive attack on the various problems we face. So here you see the black line, GDP growing about 2% a year. Our analysis says that if we put a lot of effort into reducing greenhouse gas emissions, this isn't the net zero scenario, by the way, it's a pretty significant reduction. It's not net zero. It will actually reduce growth in GDP. And the reason for that is we've been diverting a lot of investment away from investments which expand economic output to investments that do a lot to protect the environment, put it simply. And so we reduce the future capacity of the economy from what it would otherwise be to produce goods and services. So you get a decline over the long term in GDP. And here's the sustainable prosperity scenario where economic growth has come to an end after about 2050. Here's the unemployment rate. It's more volatile with the sustainable prosperity scenario, but it still stays within the sort of 5 to 7% range that we're used to. But it doesn't look, it's not a gain in any sense from our sustainable prosperity scenario. Now, carbon emissions is a different story. This is a disastrous scenario, especially if it's followed around the world. Here's the carbon reduction scenario, get a good level of reduction. Here's the net zero reduction where we go further with our green investment and slow the economy down. Income inequality, well, this really depends. This is a measure of income inequality, the Gini coefficient. We've assumed it doesn't change under the first two scenarios, but under the third, because we start redistributing significant sums of money to poorer people, this coefficient comes down. It could come down further if the redistribution was greater. And in a simulation model, you can try different things, but that's what we did for that. Annual hours worked is an interesting story. We'd all have more leisure time under a sustainable prosperity scenario, on average working shorter hours. These aren't ridiculously short, by the way. There are European countries which are already have an annual work hours of about 1,300, 1,350, and that's what this is. And household indebtedness actually is less under the sustainable prosperity scenario because households are borrowing less to consume less. Now, I'll just mention quickly finance. I said we included in the model. This is quite interesting because it makes a distinction between the private sector, how much it borrows or lends, and the public sector, how much it borrows or lends. And it's a fact of financial life that what the private sector lends, the public sector borrows. And you combine those two together and you get no net lending. Now, by the way, private sector is defined to include international lending and borrowing as well. But you see, there's that mirror image. So when we hear talk about the public sector balancing its budget, it's another way of saying that net lending in the private sector will be reduced to zero. Funnily enough, that's exactly what happens in that sustainable prosperity scenario. Private sector lending and public sector net lending essentially zero. Now, this model, because it's an ecological macroeconomic model, also keeps track of material throughput. So the top graph shows total material inputs projected into the Canadian economy for the three scenarios, and total material disposition. So if the model is following the basic laws of physics, material never gets destroyed, it gets rearranged. What we bring in ought to be tracked into how it's disposed of, either into products or into waste or recycling. And you'll see that the two graphs are identical, which means that with the business as usual case, the most economic growth also includes the greatest use of materials, slightly less for renewable, the carbon scenario, and actually goes into decline with the sustainable prosperity scenario. And it's mirrored in the total disposition. This is quite, I have to say, I'm not boasting, but it's quite unusual in a macro model to be tracking the financial balances and the material balances at the same time. Well, to judge overall how well these scenarios compare, we invented an index. It includes GDP per capita. If that goes up, we said, yeah, we'll count that as a plus for prosperity. But if any of these things go up, the unemployment rate, the inequality measure, government debt to GDP, and so on, all the way down to the environmental burden index, then those are negative things. So we add them all together, and this is what we find. The base case scenario is a very bad scenario, very gloomy scenario. The carbon reduction scenario is better, but we still would see a somewhat, according to this sustainable prosperity index, looking at all of these factors, a decline in well-being. Only with a sustainable prosperity scenario do we see an improvement. But it's nice to know, or nice to be able to suggest that an improvement is still possible. So most people who write about these kinds of things have a list of what needs to change. I'm going to give you a list that dates from about 2008, the first edition of my Managing Without Growth book. But I've seen no reason to change the list because the things still need changing. We need new meanings and measures of success. GDP doesn't cut it. And there are many alternatives that have been proposed, but we need to settle on one and put it to work. I don't believe that addressing environmental problems can only be done by improvements in efficiency, less emissions per dollar, less land conversions per dollar, whatever. What we need are absolute limits on the materials that we allow ourselves to use, the energy that we use, what kind of form it takes, the waste we produce, and land use conversion. We're creeping very slowly in the policy world towards that, but I think it can become front and center. If we did that, prices would automatically be more meaningful. Environmental scarcity would be more adequately, well, it hardly appears in our current market prices. It would tend to show up there, and that would be a good thing. It would influence behavior in a positive way. We need more durable and repairable products. The rise of the maker movement is an indication that others are thinking along the same way. Lots more can be done. Companies talk about being more sustainable, which is one dimension they have control over. They need to put more effort into it. Fewer status goods, buying something to make yourself look better than somebody else. We all know what's wrong with that, and we've got to reduce the social pressures for people to buy things which they don't really want because of what they can give them in real services, but because they're competing with others. I'm not a friend of advertising. Advertising used to be, a long time ago, much more informative than it is now. Now it mostly plays the role of promoting a consumer society, and that's not serving us well. We also used to try to screen technology before we'd allow it to sort of run rampant in the economy. I think we've got to find ways to do that again. That's a tough one. But if we definitely need a more efficient capital stock, which would come about partly from some of the other measures that I've said. I think we've gone too far with globalization. We saw that through COVID, how vulnerable different economies have become, including ours. Supply lines were very long and fragile, but there are other reasons for being more local and less global. And the key to this, I have to say, is we've got to put the brakes on the mobility of capital. We could perhaps discuss that later in the chat or in the Q&A. Definitely need reduced inequality. Lots being said about that. Not much being done about it, but it's very important. Less work and more leisure, just as the sustainable prosperity scenario says could be possible in a very reasonable future. I think that would be very promising. And I think I counted 12 twice. This is actually 13 now. Education, this is the sector that I most recently come from, should be for life, not just trying to train people for jobs that we're not very good, at least in the academic world, of predicting. Can we adapt to the kind of changes that I've suggested are possible and necessary? It's trite to say it, but human species is very adaptable. The biggest problem to me is our institutions. I'm sure you can recognize that variety of institutions. They tend to be very slow to move and to change and resistant to change. And that is a real handicap that I don't have a ready answer to, but at least we have to recognize it as a problem. Finally, I can't resist telling you about this new book that I've just published on Herman Daly's life and ideas. I hope that you've all heard and read Herman's work, some of it. But Herman is the economist, above all, who's done the most to promote and develop the kind of ideas I've summarized for you today. On the 24th of November, we're having a virtual book launch. I think the link is in the chat now, and so everyone is invited. Herman is still with us, I'm glad to say, and will be participating in the launch along with Tim Jackson from Britain and Catherine Trebek from the We All group, and Ellie Perkins, a colleague of mine. So with that, I think I'll draw to a close and stop sharing my screen.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. For those who have questions, feel free to post them in the chat and I will watch that. But I'm going to start with posing one of my own. Folks who support the idea of growth often, promote the idea that we can decouple our economy from economic harm, and you showed us some graphs and some models around that. But what about the sort of play devil's advocate? The upcoming transformation to much more digital products and so on. And I read a blog post just a little while ago around the and I'm trying to remember the name, who authored it, so I forget that, but it was just a quick blog post talking about the new Facebook initiative to build sort of this online fake world that we would all live in. And if that came to fruition and we're all living in these, of course this is an extreme example, but what forms of decoupling are actually possible, and to what level is it, can we still have some growth through these types of very low consumption or low impact products, I should say?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and I'll try to answer the best way I can. First of all, even in an economy that overall is not growing, there will be some sectors that will grow, and you'll want them to grow. For example, renewable energy to displace fossil fuels, and there are other sectors that you want to shrink. So it's a more complicated and rich story than I was able to tell in a few moments. So that's one thing. The second thing is we want decoupling. Everybody should want decoupling. But the faster your economy grows, the faster your rate of decoupling has to be to achieve any objective. Now that's a problem for the decouplers, because they like to promote a green growth future as one where economic growth might be even faster than we've had in the recent past. And so what they're saying is, let's put our bets there that we can then decouple sufficiently faster than if the economy wasn't growing so fast. It's a bit odd, but you see what I mean, that if the economy doesn't grow, then you still need to decouple, but the rate of decoupling doesn't have to be as fast. As for the digital economy, well, I think the society you describe is not one that I would welcome anyway. Secondly, as I'm sure you know, Bob, the statistics coming out on the energy required for Bitcoin, for example, and from computing generally is astonishingly high. Now, they can say, well, we're going to get that from renewable sources. One thing about renewable sources of energy, particularly wind and solar, which are very popular, and I'm a huge supporter of them, don't get me wrong, but they're not renewable in anything but the energy. They're very materials intensive. And so there's real concern and there's concern now in developing countries, what's the first world going to do when it wants all these materials for its transition to renewables? They're going to come after us. There's a lot of concern about that, and I think rightly so. So it's a very complicated situation. I think it's inevitable that people are going to cling to growth one way or the other to solve whatever problem they're interested in. But that, to me, takes us away from a very important element. We shouldn't assume growth has got to be part of the solution, especially when we know it doesn't necessarily bring us happiness, when we're already wealthy, and that our biggest problem is distribution, not that we need more stuff.
Okay, great. So Lenore asked a question here. What are some examples or suggestions of new measures of success, alternatives to GDP? Is there one or two that you would recommend that we dig into?
Right. Well, a terrific question. So the questions are often better than the answers. I apologize in advance for that. But there are many candidates. Herman Daly, who I've already mentioned, was one of the inventors of something called the Index for Human Well-being, something like that. I'm sorry, I ought to know, having just written his biography. But what they do, and this has become known as the Genuine Progress Index. They start from consumption. So they take the consumption expenditures that are in GDP. They take away from that expenditures which they call defensive. What that means is if crime goes up, for example, and people spend more money on private security services, it's just a mistake to include those expenditures as somehow adding to our well-being, comparable, say, with food or housing, because they're being spent to defend ourselves because the situation's got worse. They do the same for the public sector. You count public sector expenditures as beneficial, but not if they're defensive. And so you take that out. You add in things that are missing from GDP, such as the value of unpaid work. It's still fairly true to say that women do the bulk of unpaid work, and that's not recognized as contributing to well-being. So in other words, they make many more adjustments in this. This gives you an example. And of course, the environmental costs of growth are taken out of them, are included in this index. And what you see in the US, where some of this work has been done, it's been done in other places too. I think in fact it's been done for Alberta, but I'm not quite sure of that. Is that in recent years, the costs of growth have come to outweigh the benefits measured in these terms. Now, Herman Daly, who's got a great turn of phrase, growth has become uneconomic because it's actually doing more harm than good. What we have is not economic growth, we have uneconomic growth. So that's one way, but there are many other approaches which don't measure things in dollars. I just want to make this point. You see, there's the approach to measuring progress and well-being using dollars, but doing it more sensibly. And there's alternative measures which ask people directly how happy they are. That's why we have these world happiness reports that come out every year for every country. Very interesting. Or you have measures like the ecological footprint, which measures the environmental impact, the extent to which we are overusing the biocapacity, the capacity of the biosphere to regenerate itself. The difficulty is, how do you put these together? Which ones do you choose? Which would have sufficient buy-in? And what I would suggest is, if this is something you're interested in, as Lenore, I think, then there's a huge literature, and we need to open up this discussion about what would be the next best measure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Here's a bit of a specific question. For the graph that plots income against happiness early on in your presentation, is that average income or median income?
Average. Average per capita income. Yes. Now I asked my own follow-up question. I mean, one way of interpreting that graph is we know that at least for a large part of that period, there has been an increase in inequality. And so the increase in inequality could be an explanatory factor for why there was that divergence between average GDP and self-reported happiness. I'm really happy that I think that was what the questioner was getting at.
Yeah, I think so as
because
well.
that's exactly what those kind of graphs, and all of the graphs I've shown you are not answers. They are intended to provoke further discussion, new questions, more examination. And that was an example of that.
Okay, this is from Grace. Thank you, Peter. It's been an insightful discussion. I'm wondering if and where you are seeing this push away from GDP and growth from within government, financial institutions, and so on. And what are some ways that citizens can promote the no growth movement in different sectors?
Okay, well, I'll first of all, one place to look is at the degrowth movement, which is increasingly prominent in Europe. Some really good stuff written on degrowth. Degrowth is not a term I particularly use because it's an ugly word and it requires rather a lot of explanation. And it's a translation from the French, but the degrowth movement is beginning to have an influence, certainly in its local area. Even the OECD is looking at, this goes back almost to the previous question, is looking at alternative measures of success. So you should look at the OECD material, and it's really significant that they recognize that pursuing GDP somehow for its own sake is just not on anymore. It doesn't make sense, and they're groping for a better opportunity. What I found, because I've spoken along these lines to various governments at different levels of government, is that you generally find the municipalities are the most receptive, the provinces are second, and national governments are least receptive. And you can begin to understand that. It's the municipalities that have to deal head on with waste, with water supply. Their land is obviously limited, so you can see yes, we don't necessarily want to grow more. We just want to live better. Can't we just separate the two? It's not so significant at the provincial level, especially in Canada, where our provinces are so large. I come from Britain, as you can probably tell from my accent. There's much greater consciousness of the limits of Britain, and even more so on continental Europe. The EU is way more aware of these issues, and they have a much better data that they collect in order, like that material flow question I kept raising. Over there, they measure the material flow through all of their economies and have done for about a decade, and you can see the change. So I don't know if I've answered your question very well. By the way, in the developing world, there's similar discussions, but using very different language. In Latin America, for example, they talk about buen vivir. My Spanish isn't very good, but it means the good life. When they talk about what is the good life, they don't want necessarily the Western model that we work so hard to promote. So there's loads of stuff going on. It's very exciting. I know that this is a terrible time to be young in the sense that there's so much gloom out there, but it's also an incredibly exciting time to have all these interesting problems to work on. I sometimes, well, I won't say it, but I'll leave it there. Yeah. So you've got lots of good work to do. We need it done.
Okay, sounds good. Here's a question from Monica, who asks, some may argue that economic growth is required to create new jobs. And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, in our current economic system, there's a lot of truth in what's been said. One of the things I used to do was to collect headlines in newspapers when a new factory was opened. And one after another, what you would see when, say, at a ribbon cutting for a factory is 1,000 new jobs created. No mention of the product, or no mention that there's some shortage of product that the factory is going to solve. It's all about job creation. Now, isn't that interesting? That the purpose of economic growth, if you like, is more about job creation than in solving some scarcities. Well, once we realize that, then we have to think hard about, aren't there better ways to create jobs? Well, one way is if the time that people spent working was reduced in the way I suggested, then there's more jobs. Same amount of work. On average, people work fewer hours. There's going to be more people working. And that's one way to have full employment in an economy that's not relying on growth, that's not growing, by giving people more leisure time and sharing out the work. But our economic system right now is not necessarily putting a premium on that. And one of the reasons, I think, is the decline in the influence of the labor movement, particularly in Canada, less so in some parts of Europe. The labor movement bargained for decades for shorter working hours. But for the last 20 years in Canada, maybe a little more, there's been no reduction in average work hours, except in very unusual periods of time. So we must understand that this notion that you need economic growth to have employment is a characteristic of a particular type of economy that we have that is crying out for change.
Okay, sounds good. Sorry, I'm just managing the chat here. Oh, here's one from Heather. Are there 1 or 2 items from your list of 12 that would have a disproportionately positive impact and thus should be prioritized?
Wow, that's a good question. I do put the number one for a reason. That's the one about finding better measures of success. But it's not because doing it will suddenly change the world, though I do think it'll have a beneficial impact because, as I said in the introduction, I've had some years' experience in government. What you have to do as a civil servant to be successful is to be sensitive to the priorities of government. If the priorities of government are economic growth, then you can't just turn your back on that as a civil servant. So if the priority of government becomes well-being, which has many contributing factors, that broadens the scope of the kind of policies that the civil service can generate that they know the government will be interested in. So changing the measure of success is very important. But I also put it number one because I think we can do it. I think it's really easy. I think there's so much work being done by the World Bank, by the OECD, even by the IMF, that apart from all the NGOs doing the work and academics, so it may not have the biggest impact, but it has doability, a high doability component. For the second one, I would put very importantly is the limits on throughput, the limits on, well, like we're trying to do with greenhouse gases. The world is struggling to put a limit on the amount of new greenhouse gases it puts into the atmosphere. What I've suggested is there's an overemphasis on flow, not enough emphasis on stock, but nonetheless, the efforts being made. That's certainly a step in the right direction, but don't stop with greenhouse gases. That approach really applies to so many impacts of human activity on the biosphere. So we've got to stop converting forests into farmland to produce animal food for pets. I am a pet owner. I love pets, but that's not a healthy transformation that we're making, in my view. So we need to put more limits on land transformation, limits on mining, oil. Well, moving out of fossil fuels is related to putting a limit on the fossil fuels you take out of the ground. So I would like to see a much more comprehensive attack on that problem, and I would do it in a way that is informed by planetary boundaries and the ecological footprint and some of these other new metrics and new ways of looking at things that could really advance this program.
Okay, great. Here's one from Alexis. If political jurisdictions are required to borrow from private commercial banks for public projects such as green infrastructure at interest, doesn't the repayment of the loans necessitate GDP or economic growth? You have to grow the tax base to repay these loans. So we need to grow to pay for things.
The answer is no, but it's not an easy one to understand. If you'll allow me, I'll refer you to a paper published by Tim Jackson and myself on that very topic. There are many what we call growth imperatives in our current economic system. Forces all sort of pointing in that pro-growth direction. And we decided, because we'd heard this proposition put forward a number of times by other academics as well, and we thought we had a way of analyzing that, and so we've developed a simulation model which looks precisely at that question. And I think the way to understand it is this. First of all, governments, if they own their central bank, don't have to borrow money from the private sector. That's their choice. They own the bank. If you owned a bank, would you borrow from another bank? No. This is one of the lessons from modern money theory. And there's a very articulate woman, Stephanie Kelton, who's written about this and talks about it on the internet. And I highly recommend that you listen to her and read her stuff. The second thing is, even if the borrowing was from the private banks, what we show in our work is that as long as the interest that's received on the loans that the banks make are paid out to the shareholders, who then spend the money in the economy, you don't have to expand the economy for that system to be sustainable in that particular aspect. But look, it's a good question. But I can make one more point that's helped me a lot with it. When we talk about growth in GDP, we're talking about growth in real production. You're talking about money. You're talking about something that, in a sense, doesn't have a physical dimension to it. In fact, less and less these days. When you buy something with your card, you never see any dollars you can hold in your hand. To think there's somehow an automatic link between the non-material and the material is an error. You have to actually show in some detail what you think that link is. And when we investigated it, we found that in fact the link isn't tight at all.
Okay, great. One last question. We've got a couple minutes left here. You mentioned the need for more informative advertising, and I'm just wondering if you're aware of any research into the economic impact on households of advertising products in the manner we currently do. So what's the negative impact of advertising? Is it really big, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I read an astonishing statistic last week, and it's so astonishing to me. I can't believe it. They say the average American sees 6,000 to 10,000 ads a day. Wow. It just sounds unbelievable, because we're not that different from the average American. So we are being smothered with efforts to get us to buy things. Now, why do I find a problem with that? First of all, we're being misled. One aspect of advertising is to show a person or a group with a problem, and then tell them that problem can be fixed if they'll only buy product X. So you see, well, if you watch American television, the ads for medicines are just amazing. It's telling you got this problem, buy this medicine, and then they talk in very fast language about all the health warnings. It's just it's nauseating. Advertising to children is really bad, because they are the ones going through the most important part of the socialization process. And what they get from advertising, as much as anything else, is a lifestyle image, what a successful person looks like. One of the things that immigrants are known to do, and this is not a criticism of them at all, but if you want to find out what's meant by success in Canada, look at the ads, because they just show you successful people. You see with the ads for lotteries, the only people they ever show you are the winners. They never show you the enormous crowds of people who lost money on the same lottery. Now, people do study this. I just read around the issue, and I'm sure if you want to understand it more, there was a terrific few books written some years ago by William Leis, L-E-I-S-S. Bill Leis, as he's known, became the president of the Royal Society of Canada. Marvelous analysis of advertising. So it's a very dangerous aspect of our society, and sad to say, it's wound up with the promotion of economic growth.
Well, thank you for that. That's great. It's actually something I'm talking about in my course this week. So hear it pop up today. Well, we're pretty much at time, Peter. This has been really great. Honestly, I've watched lots of presentations on growth and degrowth, and I've really enjoyed this and learned a lot. And I know that everyone else in the audience has as well. and others who will watch this later once we post it. So thank you very much for your time and for the great presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Great. All right. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much.